The evening rain cast a melancholy glow over Manhattan's Upper East Side as Alexander Blackwood, CEO of Blackwood Global Investments, strode toward his waiting limousine. At 45, with salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes, Alexander commanded attention in every boardroom across America. His $9.2 billion net worth made him one of New York's most eligible bachelors, yet personal connections remained elusive for a man who had sacrificed everything for success. Tonight was no different from countless others. Another late exit from his glass tower, another victory in the financial arena, another empty penthouse awaiting his return. The acquisition of Tech Vision had been particularly brutal, a $1.4 billion hostile takeover that had left dozens unemployed, but shareholders ecstatic. Alexander felt nothing but the familiar cold satisfaction of victory. As his driver held the car door, something unexpected caught Alexander's eye. A small figure huddled under the awning of a closed boutique across the street. In the glow of the street lamp, a boy no older than 9 sat on a cardboard box, shoulders hunched against the chill. Beside him lay a single item, a vintage Star Wars action figure still in its original packaging. Alexander's step faltered. The boy's thin frame and determined expression struck a chord deep within him, awakening memories he'd long suppressed. Against his better judgment, Alexander waved his driver off and crossed the rain-slicked street. "Aren't you a bit young to be out alone at this hour?" Alexander asked, his voice gentler than it had been all day. The boy looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but defiant. "I'm selling this. It's the last one from my collection. My mom needs surgery tonight, and we're still short. My name is Theo Teller, and if this introduction has already sparked your curiosity, leave your like to follow the unfolding of this extraordinary journey. If you've ever encountered a moment that changed your perspective in an instant, subscribe now to the channel and share in the comments what was the most unexpected encounter that changed your life, just like our protagonist is about to experience. Tell me also which city you're watching this story from. Each message and subscription gives me strength to bring more stories that will stir your emotions." Alexander crouched down, examining the action figure, a limited edition Boba Fett worth perhaps $200 to collectors. "How much are you asking for it?" "Whatever you can give," the boy replied, his voice trembling slightly. "My mom has $3,700, but the doctor says we need $5,000 for the deposit. I've been trying all day." Something about the boy's determination reminded Alexander of himself decades ago, before wealth had insulated him from life's harsh realities. The difference was stark. Young Alexander had fought to build an empire. This child was fighting to save his mother. "What's your name?" Alexander asked, surprised by his own interest. Ethan Sawyer," the boy replied, extending a small hand with surprising formality. Alexander took the hand, noting calluses that no child should have. "Your mother's at the hospital now." Ethan nodded, pointing eastward. "Manhattan Memorial. She collapsed at work this morning. They say it's her heart." A strange sensation settled in Alexander's chest, the unfamiliar weight of another's struggle. For a man who made million-dollar decisions with clinical detachment, this simple human drama on a rainy street corner felt inexplicably significant. Alexander glanced at his watch, a $375,000 Patek Philippe that could pay for Ethan's mother's surgery 10 times over. The realization felt like a physical blow. When had money become so meaningless to him, yet so desperately important to others? "Come with me," Alexander said, surprising himself again. "I'd like to help." Suspicion flashed across Ethan's face, street smarts beyond his years. "My mom says I shouldn't go with strangers." Alexander nodded approvingly. "Your mother is right. How about this? I'll drive you to the hospital, but you can call someone first to let them know who you're with." He handed Ethan his business card, embossed with the Blackwood Global logo. Ethan's eyes widened as recognition dawned. "You're that guy from the magazines, the one who owns like half of New York." "Not quite half," Alexander said with the ghost of a smile. "Just the profitable parts." The limousine ride to Manhattan Memorial was brief but transformative. As Alexander listened to Ethan describe his mother, Sarah Sawyer, a single parent who worked 2 jobs as a nurse's aide and weekend barista, he felt an uncomfortable awareness of how disconnected he'd become from ordinary struggle. "She never complains," Ethan said proudly. "Even when we had to move to the smaller apartment after Dad left, she still reads to me every night, no matter how tired she is." E.T. The hospital's emergency entrance was a stark contrast to the private clinics Alexander frequented. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, illuminating crowded waiting areas where anxiety hung thick in the air. Following Ethan through the sliding doors, Alexander felt bizarrely out of place in his $8,000 Tom Ford suit. At the nurse's station, Ethan introduced himself with practiced poise. "I'm here to see my mom, Sarah Sawyer. She's waiting for heart surgery." The nurse looked up wearily, then did a double take at Alexander standing behind the boy. "Are you family?" she asked, addressing the billionaire. Before Alexander could respond, a doctor approached, clipboard in hand. "Ethan, we've been trying to reach your aunt. Your mother's condition has stabilized, but we need to perform the procedure tonight. Unfortunately, there's still the matter of the deposit before we can schedule the OR." Ethan clutched his action figure tighter. "We brought help," he said, gesturing to Alexander. The doctor assessed Alexander with professional detachment. "Are you a relative, sir?" "A friend of the family," Alexander replied smoothly, years of boardroom negotiations making the lie effortless. "I understand there's a financial matter to resolve. Perhaps we could discuss this privately." In the doctor's small office, Alexander learned that Sarah Sawyer, 34, had suffered complications from a congenital heart condition, one that could have been treated years earlier had she prioritized her own health over her son's needs. The surgery would cost $43,000, with the hospital requiring an immediate deposit. "I'll cover all expenses," Alexander said without hesitation, sliding his corporate card across the desk. "And I want her transferred to the private wing, the best room available." The doctor's expression shifted from skepticism to relief. "That's very generous, Mr. Blackwood," Alexander supplied. "And it's not generosity. It's what should happen in a functioning society. Will she recover fully with proper treatment? With the surgery and proper follow-up care, she has an excellent prognosis. She's young and otherwise healthy." Alexander nodded, signing the necessary paperwork. "Then let's proceed immediately." When he returned to the waiting area, he found Ethan sitting rigidly in a plastic chair, still clutching his treasured action figure. Alexander sat beside him, suddenly unsure what to say to a child facing his mother's mortality. "Your mother is going to have her surgery now," Alexander explained, his usual commanding tone softened. "I've taken care of the hospital bill." Ethan looked up, his young face a battlefield of hope and disbelief. "All of it? Really?" "All of it," Alexander confirmed. "And I've arranged for her to have the best doctors in the hospital." Tears welled in Ethan's eyes, not the quiet resignation Alexander had witnessed earlier, but overwhelming relief. "Why would you do that for us? You don't even know us." The question pierced Alexander with unexpected force. Why indeed? In 20 years of wealth accumulation, he'd signed countless charitable donation checks, but always with strategic precision. Tax benefits, networking opportunities, brand enhancement. This impulsive act offered none of those advantages. "Sometimes people just help each other, Ethan," he said finally, the words feeling foreign on his tongue. A small hand extended toward him, offering the Star Wars figure. "Then you should have this. It's all I have to give you." Alexander gently pushed the toy back. "Keep it. Some things are worth more than money." As they settled in for the wait, a hospital social worker approached. "Ethan, I'm Ms. Rodriguez. We've reached your Aunt Clara. She's on her way, but with the storm and traffic, it might be a couple of hours." Ethan nodded bravely. "That's okay. Mr. Blackwood is keeping me company." The social worker assessed Alexander with professional suspicion. "And you are?" "A friend," Alexander replied, surprising himself with how much he wanted that simple word to be true. After she departed, seemingly satisfied, Alexander realized he hadn't eaten since a perfunctory lunch meeting 12 hours earlier. "Are you hungry, Ethan? I could send my driver for something." Ethan hesitated. "Maybe a little. Mom and I usually have pizza on Fridays." Alexander texted his driver, and 30 minutes later, they shared a pepperoni pizza on the small table in the waiting area. The billionaire and the boy, an unlikely pair connected by circumstance and a growing sense of something neither could name. "My mom would like you," Ethan said between bites. "She always says you can tell everything about a person by how they act when nobody important is watching." The observation, so innocent yet profound, hit Alexander with unexpected force. By Sarah Sawyer's standard, how would he measure? His entire empire was built on being watched, evaluated, feared. When was the last time he'd done anything simply because it was right? As they finished eating, Ethan grew quieter, the strain of the day evident in his drooping shoulders. Alexander found himself sharing stories of his own childhood, memories he rarely revisited, of building model airplanes with his father before cancer took him, leaving 16-year-old Alexander to fend for his mother and sisters. "What happened to them?" "Your mom and sisters?" Ethan asked, stifling a yawn. Alexander's expression darkened. "My mother passed away 10 years ago. My sisters—" He paused, realizing he hadn't spoken to either in nearly 5 years, not since the contentious division of their mother's modest estate, another failure he buried beneath work and wealth. "I haven't been a very good brother," he admitted, the confession surprisingly liberating. Ethan considered this with solemn wisdom. "You could call them. Mom says it's never too late to fix things that matter." Before Alexander could respond, a surgeon appeared in blue scrubs. "Family of Sarah Sawyer?" Ethan stood on shaky legs, and Alexander found himself rising alongside the boy, a protective hand resting lightly on his shoulder. "The surgery went well," the surgeon said, his eyes kind beneath his surgical cap. "Your mother's heart condition was more complex than we initially thought, but we were able to repair the valve successfully. She's in recovery now, and will be moved to a private room shortly, thanks to Mr. Blackwood's arrangements." Ethan's shoulders slumped with relief. "Can I see her?" "In about an hour," the surgeon replied. "She's still waking up from anesthesia. She asked about you first thing, though." As the surgeon departed, Ethan turned to Alexander, unexpected tears streaming down his face. Not tears of fear this time, but pure emotional release. Without thinking, Alexander knelt and opened his arms. The boy fell into them, his small frame shaking with sobs. "She's gonna be okay," Ethan whispered, his voice muffled against Alexander's expensive suit jacket. "She's really gonna be okay." Alexander held the boy awkwardly at first, then with growing confidence. When was the last time he'd embraced another human being with genuine emotion rather than social obligation? The warmth of Ethan's trust penetrated layers of defenses built over decades. "Yes, she is," Alexander assured him, "and you were incredibly brave today." As Ethan's tears subsided, Alexander's phone vibrated in his pocket. Glancing at the screen, he saw his COO's name flashing, the third call in the past hour. The Asian markets were opening, and decisions about the Tech Vision acquisition couldn't wait. Any other day, any other moment, Alexander would have answered immediately, regardless of the hour. Tonight, he silenced the phone. If you believe in the power of unexpected encounters to change lives, consider subscribing to this channel for more profound stories like this one. Every subscription reminds us that connections matter more than any material possession. "Let's find something to drink while we wait to see your mom," Alexander suggested, guiding Ethan toward the hospital cafeteria. Over hot chocolate and coffee, Alexander found himself doing something he rarely did: listening. Ethan shared details of his life with the unfiltered honesty of childhood, his favorite subjects in school, science and art, his dream of becoming a veterinarian, the neighborhood chess club where he played on Saturdays. "Mom always makes time to take me, even when she's worked all night," Ethan said proudly. "She says I have a natural strategic mind." Alexander smiled, recognizing a kindred spirit. I played chess competitively in college. Perhaps we could play sometime." The words escaped before he could analyze their implications. Was he really suggesting a future connection with this child and his mother? The thought should have triggered his well-honed avoidance instincts. Instead, it felt right in a way few things had in years. A nurse interrupted their conversation. "Ethan, your mother's asking for you. She's been moved to room 718. As they rode the elevator to the 7th floor, Alexander felt an unfamiliar sensation, nervous anticipation. For decades, he'd walked into rooms knowing exactly who he was, the most powerful person present. Now, he was about to meet a woman whose strength might challenge everything he thought he knew about power. Outside room 718, Ethan hesitated. "Will you come in with me? I want Mom to meet you." Alexander straightened his tie, a gesture of boardroom habit rather than necessity. "Are you sure? This should be a private moment between you two." Ethan shook his head. "You're the reason she got her surgery. You're part of our story now." Part of their story? The phrase resonated within Alexander as he followed Ethan into the hospital room. In his world of mergers and acquisitions, stories were carefully crafted narratives designed to manipulate stock prices and investor confidence. This story, unfolding without his control, felt dangerous and vital in equal measure. Sarah Sawyer lay propped against white pillows, an IV line trailing from her arm and monitoring equipment humming softly beside her. Despite the surgical ordeal, her beauty struck Alexander immediately. Not the manufactured perfection of his usual social circle, but something more authentic. Her dark hair fell in natural waves around a face lined with both worry and laughter. Even pale from surgery, her eyes lit up when they fell on her son. "There's my brave boy," she said, her voice raspy but strong. Ethan rushed to her bedside, carefully hugging her while avoiding the medical equipment. "Mom, the doctor said you're going to be all better now." Sarah kissed his forehead, then looked up, noticing Alexander for the first time. Confusion crossed her features, followed by wariness. "Mom, this is Mr. Blackwood," Ethan explained excitedly. "He found me selling my Boba Fett and paid for your whole surgery and everything. He even got us pizza while we waited." Sarah's expression shifted from confusion to shock. "You paid for my surgery?" Her gaze intensified, taking in Alexander's bespoke suit and the unmistakable aura of wealth. "Why would you do that for strangers?" The question cut through pretense. In the sterile hospital room, faced with this woman's direct gaze, Alexander couldn't summon his usual polished responses. "Your son reminded me of something I'd forgotten," he admitted, "that some things matter more than money." Sarah studied him with a penetrating gaze that made Alexander, accustomed to intimidating seasoned executives, shift uncomfortably. "Thank you," she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you, but—" "There's nothing to repay," Alexander interrupted. "Consider it an investment in Ethan's future." Something flickered in Sarah's eyes. Pride, perhaps, or determination. "We're not a charity case, Mr. Blackwood. I've always paid my debts." "Mom," Ethan whispered urgently, "he's one of the richest guys in America. It's probably like buying a coffee for him." A smile touched Sarah's lips. "Ethan manners," she chided gently, before returning her attention to Alexander. "While I appreciate the help, I need my son to understand that we stand on our own feet." Alexander respected her immediately for it. How many people had he met who would establish boundaries while lying in a hospital bed, indebted to a stranger for a life-saving procedure? "Perhaps we can discuss a suitable arrangement after you've recovered," he conceded. "A payment plan that won't burden you." Sarah nodded, satisfied with the compromise. The conversation shifted as a nurse entered to check Sarah's vitals, discussing recovery protocols and medication schedules. Alexander stepped back, observing the easy affection between mother and son, their inside jokes and silent communications that spoke of a deep bond. A text message vibrated in his pocket. His executive assistant, "Tokyo investors expecting your call in 15 minutes, critical to closing." Alexander glanced from the message to the scene before him. In his corporate life, critical meant billion-dollar deals. Here, it had meant a boy selling his treasured possession to save his mother's life. The contrast was stark, illuminating the hollow victories that had defined his existence. "I should go," he said when the nurse departed. "You need rest, and I have a call." He extracted a business card and placed it on the bedside table. "My personal number is on the back. If you need anything during your recovery, anything at all, please don't hesitate." Sarah accepted the card with a graceful nod. "Thank you, Mr. Blackwood, truly. Not just for the financial help, but for looking after my son. That means more than you know." "Alexander, please," he corrected, suddenly uncomfortable with formality. "Sarah," she responded with a small smile. "And perhaps, when I'm recovered, you'll let me cook you a proper thank you dinner. Nothing fancy, but Ethan tells me you're probably surviving on takeout and restaurant meals." The invitation, so ordinary yet so sincere, caught Alexander off guard. When had someone last invited him to their home without an agenda? When had he last accepted? "I'd like that," he said, surprising himself with his sincerity. In the week following Sarah's surgery, Alexander found himself in uncharted territory. He had instructed his assistant to clear his calendar of all non-essential meetings, something that had never happened in his 20-year career unless he was closing a major acquisition. The simple explanation he offered, "personal matter requiring my attention," had set off a flurry of speculation throughout Blackwood Global. Alexander ignored the rumors. For the first time in decades, something mattered more than perception and power. He visited the hospital daily, initially with the pragmatic excuse of ensuring Sarah received the best care. He brought proper meals for Ethan, arranged for a private tutor so the boy wouldn't fall behind in school, and helped navigate the labyrinthine health insurance appeals process that had initially denied Sarah's claim. A problem that his army of lawyers resolved with ruthless efficiency. Today, 1 week post-surgery, Alexander arrived at the hospital to find Sarah sitting up. Color returned to her cheeks, reviewing discharge papers. "The doctor says I can go home tomorrow," she announced, looking up as he entered. "You've been issued a temporary reprieve from hospital cafeteria coffee." Alexander smiled, setting down the leather portfolio he carried. Over the past week, he'd grown accustomed to Sarah's gentle teasing, a refreshing change from the cautious deference he typically encountered. "Actually, I wanted to discuss your discharge arrangements," he said, taking the visitor's chair beside her bed. "Your apartment is a 4th-floor walk-up, and the doctor's orders specify no stairs for at least 2 weeks." Sarah's expression tightened. "I thought about that. My friend Melissa has a ground-floor apartment with a spare room. She's offered to let us stay until I'm cleared for stairs." "I have an alternative proposal," Alexander said, opening his portfolio. "I own a residential building in Greenwich Village. There's a vacant 2-bedroom unit on the ground floor with accessibility features. It's yours for as long as you need during recovery." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Alexander, that's incredibly generous, but—" "Before you refuse," he interrupted gently, "please consider Ethan. The apartment is 3 blocks from his school. The building has 24-hour security and a doorman who can assist with groceries and packages. There's also a car service I can arrange for your follow-up appointments." He watched the internal struggle play out across Sarah's face. Pride wrestling with practicality, independence with necessity. "What's the catch?" she asked finally, direct as always. "No catch," Alexander replied. "When you're recovered, you return to your apartment if you wish, or—" He hesitated, uncharacteristically uncertain. "We could discuss a more permanent arrangement then." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "A more permanent arrangement? What exactly does that mean?" The question hung between them, loaded with possibilities neither was ready to articulate. Alexander himself wasn't entirely sure what he was proposing, only that the thought of Sarah and Ethan disappearing from his life after her recovery felt increasingly unacceptable. "It means we have options," he said carefully. "But right now, the priority is your recovery." Sarah studied him with that penetrating gaze that somehow saw past his carefully constructed facade. "You know, for a man who makes billion-dollar decisions daily, you're being remarkably vague." Alexander laughed, a genuine laugh that few in his corporate world would recognize. "I'm finding that some decisions can't be approached like business transactions. They require, exploration." A curious softness entered Sarah's expression. "All right, exploration it is. We'll accept the apartment for my recovery period, but I insist on paying a fair rent, perhaps not market rate for Greenwich Village, but something that maintains our dignity." Alexander nodded, respecting her boundary. "I'll have my assistant draw up a nominal lease agreement." Their conversation was interrupted as Ethan burst into the room, accompanied by a hospital volunteer who had been showing him the therapy dogs on the pediatric floor. "Mom, Mr. Blackwood, I just met the coolest dog named Rex, who helps kids feel better when they're scared about surgery." Ethan's excitement filled the room as he launched into a detailed description of the therapy dog program. Alexander watched Sarah's face as she listened to her son, her eyes bright with love. Something twisted in his chest, recognition of a connection he'd never prioritized in his pursuit of wealth and power. His own parents had been gone for years, his sisters estranged, romantic relationships kept superficial and brief. His empire stood tall but empty. Yet here, in this hospital room, with the nurse's aide and her chess-playing son, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood, the simple happiness of being part of something genuine. After Ethan finished his story about the therapy dogs, he turned to Alexander with curious eyes. "Are you coming over for dinner tonight? Aunt Clara brought Mom's iPad, and we were going to watch a movie." Alexander glanced at Sarah, silently seeking permission. "Hospital room picnic," she explained with a small shrug. "Clara's bringing food from that Italian place around the corner. There's always too much, if you'd like to join us." The invitation was casual, without pretense or expectation. Alexander checked his phone. 3 missed calls, 14 unread emails, a video conference with Dubai scheduled in an hour. "I'd love to," he said, putting the phone away. 3 weeks after Sarah's surgery, Alexander stood at the window of his penthouse office, gazing across the Manhattan skyline without really seeing it. The quarterly earnings report lay open on his desk, showing record profits and stock prices at an all-time high. By every measurable metric, Alexander Blackwood was at the pinnacle of success, yet his mind wasn't on acquisitions or stock options. It was on the dinner he'd shared last night with Sarah and Ethan in the Greenwich Village apartment. Their laughter as Ethan recounted his chess club victory, the warmth in Sarah's eyes as she served the homemade lasagna she'd insisted on cooking, despite his protests that she should rest, the comfortable silence as they sat together afterward, Ethan reading while the adults talked quietly over coffee. It felt like family, a concept so foreign to Alexander that he barely recognized it. "Sir?" His executive assistant, Miranda, appeared at the door. "The board members are assembled in the conference room. They're waiting for your quarterly address." Alexander nodded. "I'll be there momentarily." As Miranda withdrew, Alexander straightened his tie and gathered his notes. The speech he'd prepared was typical of his leadership style. Bold, confident, highlighting aggressive expansion plans and the ruthless efficiency that had become Blackwood Global's hallmark. The words now felt hollow. In the conference room, 20 board members and top executives rose as Alexander entered. He took his place at the head of the table, surveying the faces before him, hungry, ambitious, focused solely on the next win, the next billion, mirrors of who he had been just 1 month ago. "Good morning," he began, setting aside his prepared remarks. "Before we discuss the quarterly numbers, I'd like to share something that's been on my mind." A ripple of surprise moved through the room. Alexander Blackwood didn't share personal reflections. He issued directives and expected results. 3 weeks ago, I met a 9-year-old boy selling his most prized possession to help pay for his mother's heart surgery, Alexander continued. It was a chance encounter that should have been brief, perhaps a moment of charity before I continued with my evening. Instead, it became something more significant. The room had gone completely still, executives exchanging puzzled glances. This boy and his mother have given me a perspective I've been missing. While we've been focused on maximizing shareholder value at any cost, we've overlooked something essential: the human impact of our decisions. Alexander picked up the Tech Vision acquisition folder, the hostile takeover he'd completed the day he met Ethan. This deal displaced 347 employees, many of whom had families depending on them. We justified it as necessary market consolidation. But what if we had approached it differently? What if we had found a way to preserve those jobs while still achieving our strategic objectives? Marcus Henley, the head of acquisitions, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Alexander, sentiment doesn't drive share price. Our obligation is to our shareholders." "Is it?" Alexander challenged. "Or is that the convenient fiction we tell ourselves to justify decisions that prioritize short-term profits over long-term value creation? What about our obligation to our employees, to the communities where we operate, to society as a whole?" The silence in the room was deafening. Alexander had built his reputation on shark-like business instincts. This philosophical questioning was unprecedented. "I'm announcing a strategic shift," Alexander continued. "Effective immediately, Blackwood Global will establish an employee retention program for all acquisitions. We will create a $500 million fund for workforce development and transition assistance. And we will implement a new evaluation framework that considers social impact alongside financial returns." The board erupted in protests, voices overlapping in a cacophony of objection. Alexander let them vent their concerns, watching dispassionately as the very qualities he had cultivated in his leadership team, aggressive ambition, single-minded focus on profit, now turned against his new vision. When the noise subsided, Alexander spoke again, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable authority that had built his empire. "I understand your concerns. The path I'm proposing is more complex than our previous approach. It requires nuance, creativity, and courage. But I believe it will ultimately create more sustainable value." He paused, making eye contact with each board member. "That said, I recognize this represents a significant departure from our established strategy, so I'm putting it to a vote. Those who cannot align with this new direction are welcome to tender their resignations, with generous severance packages, of course." The ultimatum hung in the air. Alexander watched his executives calculating, reassessing, adapting to this unexpected paradigm shift. Before anyone could respond, Alexander's phone vibrated in his pocket. He rarely took calls during board meetings, but seeing Ethan's name on the screen, he'd given the boy a phone for emergencies. He felt a surge of concern. "Excuse me, I need to take this," he said, stepping away from the table. "Alexander." It was Sarah's voice, tight with tension. "I'm sorry to interrupt your work, but there's been an incident at Ethan's school. He's okay, but shaken up. Some boys were bullying him about staying in your apartment, calling him a charity case. The principal called me in." Alexander's grip tightened on the phone. "Where are you now?" "Still at the school. Ethan doesn't want to go back to class, but I'm in the middle of my shift at the clinic. I just started back yesterday and I can't. I'll be there in 20 minutes. Alexander interrupted, already moving toward the door. But your work is less important, he finished firmly. Tell Ethan I'm on my way. Alexander returned to the boardroom, where tense discussions had broken out among the executives. The meeting is adjourned until tomorrow morning, he announced. Consider the proposals I've outlined. We'll reconvene at 9 to take a formal vote. Without waiting for responses, Alexander strode out, instructing his assistant to have his car brought around. As the elevator descended, he loosened his tie and took a deep breath, recognizing the magnitude of what had just transpired. He had placed a child he'd known for mere weeks above the multi-billion-dollar enterprise he'd spent decades building, and somehow it felt like the first truly sound decision he'd made in years. Alexander found Ethan sitting in the principal's office, shoulders hunched, eyes fixed on the floor. The boy's usual brightness had dimmed, replaced by a fragility that made Alexander's chest tighten. Sarah sat beside him, her hand on his shoulder, looking pale but composed. Mr. Blackwood, the principal, Dr. Reynolds, rose to greet him with evident surprise. I wasn't expecting you to join us. Alexander moved directly to Ethan, crouching to the boy's eye level. Hey, chess master, tough day? Ethan looked up, relief washing over his face at the sight of Alexander. They said I was just your charity project, he whispered, that you feel sorry for poor people like us. The words struck Alexander like physical blows. He glanced at Sarah, seeing the complex emotions in her eyes, concern for her son, embarrassment at their situation, and something deeper that challenged Alexander to handle this delicate moment correctly. Ethan, Alexander said carefully, do you remember our chess game last weekend? The boy nodded, confusion crossing his features at the apparent change of subject. You beat me in 27 moves, Alexander continued. No one has beaten me at chess in 15 years, not my business rivals, not the strategy professors I occasionally play with. No one. He held Ethan's gaze. I don't waste my time on charity projects. I invest in people of exceptional value. You and your mother are two of the most valuable people I've ever met. Something shifted in Ethan's expression, a flicker of pride penetrating the hurt. Alexander turned to Dr. Reynolds. I'd like to understand exactly what happened and what actions the school is taking regarding the bullying. The principal straightened, adopting a more formal tone. 3 fifth-grade boys cornered Ethan during recess. They made disparaging comments about his living situation and financial circumstances. Our zero-tolerance bullying policy has been invoked. The boys have been suspended for 3 days and will write formal apologies. That addresses the symptom, Alexander said coolly, but not the cause. These boys learned to equate worth with wealth from somewhere. Sarah spoke up, her voice quiet but firm. The parents, I've encountered them at school functions. They're status conscious. Alexander nodded, a plan forming. Dr. Reynolds, I'd like to fund a comprehensive social-emotional learning program for your school, with a specific emphasis on empathy development and recognition of diverse forms of value beyond material wealth. The principal blinked, clearly caught off guard. That's very generous, Mr. Blackwood, but it's not generosity, it's necessity, Alexander interrupted. A society that teaches children to measure human worth by financial metrics is fundamentally broken. I've contributed to that problem. Now I intend to help solve it. He turned back to Ethan. As for you, chess master, how would you feel about taking the rest of the day off? I thought perhaps we could visit the Museum of Natural History. I hear they have an excellent space exhibit. Ethan's eyes widened. Really? But don't you have important meetings and stuff? I had a board meeting this morning, Alexander confirmed. I left it because this was more important. The simple truth hung in the air, a declaration of priorities that surprised even Alexander himself. Sarah's hand found his, squeezing briefly in silent acknowledgement. I can't take off work, she said regretfully. My shift at the clinic. Go, Dr. Reynolds interjected unexpectedly. Family emergencies are covered in your contract. I'll call Dr. Patel myself. An hour later, Alexander found himself in the planetarium of the Natural History Museum, Ethan on one side of him and Sarah on the other, all three gazing up at the projected cosmos swirling overhead. The narrator's voice described the formation of stars, the birth and death of solar systems, the infinite dance of galaxies across the universe. It makes our problem seem small, doesn't it? Sarah whispered, her profile illuminated by the ethereal blue light of a projected nebula. Alexander nodded, acutely aware of her proximity. And yet, he murmured, some small things contain entire universes. She turned to look at him then, her eyes searching his face with an intensity that made his breath catch. For a man accustomed to negotiating billion-dollar deals without blinking, Alexander found himself uncharacteristically nervous under her scrutiny. "Why are you really doing all this, Alexander?" she asked softly. "The truth this time, not the explanation you give your board or the principal or even Ethan." The darkness of the planetarium offered a strange privacy, the cosmic display overhead granting a perspective that made honesty seem not just possible, but essential. "Because I was dying," he said simply. "Not physically, but something in me, something essential, was nearly gone. The part that connected me to others, to purpose beyond accumulation, to meaning beyond metrics. And then I met you both." He paused, struggling to articulate feelings he'd spent decades suppressing. It was like finding a door I'd forgotten existed, one that led back to the person I might have been before success consumed me. Sarah was silent for a long moment, her gaze returning to the stars overhead. "That's a lot of expectation to put on two ordinary people." "There's nothing ordinary about either of you," Alexander replied. "And what happens," she asked, her voice barely audible, "when we can't fulfill that expectation, when the magic of new connection fades and you remember why you built those walls in the first place?" The question struck at Alexander's deepest fear. That this awakening was temporary, that he would inevitably retreat behind the fortress of wealth and power he'd constructed, that Sarah and Ethan would become just another acquisition that lost its luster once possessed. "I don't know," he admitted, the uncertainty unfamiliar and frightening. "I only know that I want to find out. If you're willing." Sarah turned to him again, her expression complex, caution warring with hope, independence with longing. "Mom, Alexander, look," Ethan whispered excitedly, pointing upward at a spectacular supernova explosion unfolding across the dome. "The narrator said that's how all the elements that make up our bodies were created. We're all made of stardust." Sarah smiled at her son's wonder, then met Alexander's gaze again. "Stardust," she repeated softly. "Maybe that's where we start. Not with expectations or definitions or plans, just with the recognition that we're all made of the same cosmic material, finding our way through the darkness together." She tentatively reached for his hand in the darkness. Alexander took it, feeling something profound in the simple connection, a beginning rather than an acquisition, a journey rather than a destination. Above them, galaxies collided and reformed, stars died and were born, cosmic forces engaged in an eternal dance of destruction and creation. Beside him, Ethan gasped in wonder at a particularly beautiful nebula, while Sarah's hand remained warm in his. Simple miracles in a universe of infinite possibility. 2 months after Sarah's surgery, Alexander stood in the kitchen of his penthouse, attempting to follow a recipe for chicken parmesan that his personal chef had assured him was foolproof. The evidence before him, chicken unevenly breaded, marinara sauce splattered across his imported marble countertop, and a small fire extinguisher deployed against an overzealous flambe attempt, suggested otherwise. "I think we might need to order takeout," he admitted as Sarah entered the kitchen, raising an eyebrow at the chaos. "The great Alexander Blackwood, defeated by poultry," she teased, moving beside him to assess the damage. "Let me see what I can salvage." With efficient movements, Sarah rescued the chicken, adjusted seasonings, and restored order to the culinary disaster. Alexander watched her work, still marveling at how naturally she had begun to occupy space in his life, and he in hers. Their relationship had evolved gradually over the past 2 months. While Sarah and Ethan had stayed in the Greenwich Village apartment during her recovery, Alexander had found himself spending less time at his penthouse and more time there, playing chess with Ethan, helping with homework, sharing simple dinners that somehow tasted better than any 5-star restaurant meal he'd ever had. As Sarah's health improved, they had established a comfortable rhythm. She had returned to work at the clinic part-time and had accepted Alexander's offer to fund her nursing degree completion, a dream she had deferred when Ethan was born. Alexander had restructured his work schedule, delegating more to his executive team and declining non-essential travel. Weekends were reserved for Ethan's chess tournaments, museum visits, or quiet evenings together. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, Sarah and Ethan were visiting the penthouse for the first time, a symbolic threshold they hadn't yet crossed. "Where's Ethan?" Alexander asked, realizing the boy wasn't with her. "Exploring your home theater," Sarah replied. "He almost fainted when he saw the screen size. I think he's calculating how many of our apartments could fit inside this penthouse." A flicker of discomfort crossed Alexander's face. The wealth disparity between them remained an unspoken tension, one that his financial support for Sarah's education and their temporary housing arrangement had both eased and complicated. "Does it bother you?" he asked quietly. "All of this?" He gestured to encompass not just the kitchen, but the entire penthouse, with its panoramic views, museum-quality art, and custom everything. Sarah considered the question as she stirred the sauce. "Not in the way you might think," she said finally. "I'm not intimidated by wealth itself. What concerns me is what it represents, the distance it can create between people, the isolation it can breed." She looked up at him. "The man I've come to know these past months, the one who leaves board meetings to comfort a bullied child, who funds community health initiatives, who sits patiently helping with 4th-grade science projects. That man isn't defined by his address or bank account." Alexander moved closer, taking the wooden spoon from her hand and setting it aside. "And what is he defined by?" "His heart," Sarah said simply. "The one he pretended didn't exist for so long." The directness of her answer disarmed him completely. Alexander had spent decades crafting an identity founded on strategic brilliance and financial acumen. Now, in his gleaming designer kitchen with sauce-splattered countertops, a nurse's aide was redefining him with a single word: heart. Before he could respond, Ethan's excited voice echoed down the hallway. "Mom! Alexander, you have to come see this view. I can see all the way to Brooklyn." They found him pressed against the floor-to-ceiling windows of the living room, breath fogging the glass as he pointed out landmarks across the cityscape. "Did you know," Ethan said without turning around, "that Alexander's building has a rooftop garden with actual trees and a telescope for stargazing? He said we could go up later." Sarah smiled at her son's excitement but asked, "Homework first, right?" Ethan's shoulders slumped momentarily before he brightened. "Actually, I finished an after-school program. Ms. Wilson checked it already." "Well done," Alexander said, ruffling the boy's hair, a gesture that had become natural over the past weeks. "How about dinner first, then stargazing?" As they settled at the dining table, rescued chicken parmesan served on Alexander's rarely used Limoges china, the conversation flowed easily between chess strategies, Sarah's nursing studies, and Alexander's new corporate social responsibility initiatives. Watching them, Alexander was struck by how seamlessly they had integrated into each other's worlds, despite the vast differences in their circumstances. After dinner, Alexander excused himself briefly to take a call from his Tokyo office. When he returned to the living room, he found Sarah standing alone by the windows, silhouetted against the city lights. "Ethan," he asked. "Bathroom?" she replied, turning to face him. "Alexander, there's something we need to discuss." The seriousness in her tone made him tense. "What is it?" "The apartment in Greenwich Village," she said. "Our arrangement was that we'd stay through my recovery. I'm fully recovered now, and the new semester starts next month. It's time for us to move back to our place." Alexander had been anticipating this conversation, dreading it even. The thought of Sarah and Ethan returning to their fourth-floor walk-up across town, of their daily presence in his life diminishing to scheduled visits, felt like a physical loss. "You could stay," he suggested carefully. "The apartment is closer to your school and Ethan's chess club. The security—" "Alexander," she interrupted gently, "we can't keep living in a borrowed space indefinitely. It creates complications." "What kind of complications?" Sarah's eyes met his directly. "Dependency, uncertainty about where this is all going. Questions from Ethan about why we're living in your building but not with you. Whispers at his school about our arrangement." "Then move in here," Alexander said, the words emerging before he could consider their implications fully. "Both of you?" Sarah's eyes widened. "You can't be serious." "I am," he realized, surprising himself with the certainty he felt. "This place has never been a home, not really. It's been a symbol of success, of status, of separation from the world. With you and Ethan here, it could be something more." "Alexander," Sarah said carefully, "we've known each other for barely 3 months. That's not enough time to make that kind of decision, especially with a child involved." She was right, of course. The rational, strategic part of Alexander's brain, the part that had built his empire, acknowledged the wisdom in her caution. Yet something deeper insisted that this wasn't a business merger, requiring due diligence and risk assessment. This was something rarer and more valuable. "Then what do you want, Sarah?" he asked quietly. "Not what makes logical sense, not what's practical or prudent. What do you want?" 1 year later, Alexander stood at the edge of Central Park, watching as Ethan expertly guided his opponent into checkmate. The outdoor chess tables were crowded with Saturday players, but a small crowd had gathered to witness the 10-year-old's remarkable skill. As the defeated opponent, a retired math professor, extended his hand in gracious defeat, Ethan beamed with quiet pride. "That's 5 straight wins," Alexander said, as Ethan bounded over to him. "The chess tournament next month should be interesting. Coach says I might qualify for the National Junior Championship if I keep practicing," Ethan replied, his confidence blossoming beyond the timid boy Alexander had met on a rainy street corner. "Then we'll practice," Alexander promised, resting his hand on the boy's shoulder. "Though soon you'll be teaching me new strategies, instead of the other way around." And they walked together through the park, heading toward the East Side apartment where Sarah would be waiting. Not the penthouse. Alexander had sold that 6 months ago, finding its ostentatious luxury increasingly at odds with his evolving values. Instead, they had chosen a spacious but modest apartment with a terrace garden where Sarah grew herbs and vegetables, a home office for Alexander's reconfigured work life, and a dedicated chess corner for Ethan. The past year had brought transformations Alexander could never have anticipated. Blackwood Global still thrived, but with a dramatically different ethos. The company had become a pioneer in ethical business practices, with a worker retention program that had been featured in Harvard Business Review. Alexander had stepped back from day-to-day operations, becoming executive chairman, while focusing more energy on the Blackwood Foundation. a philanthropic organization dedicated to healthcare access and educational equity. Sarah had completed her nursing degree with honors and now divided her time between clinical work and directing a community health initiative funded by the foundation. Her expertise in frontline healthcare had proven invaluable in shaping programs that addressed real needs rather than wealthy donors' perceptions. Their relationship had evolved with deliberate care. After that night in the penthouse, they had chosen a middle path, neither rushing into cohabitation nor retreating to separate lives. The Greenwich Village apartment had remained Sarah and Ethan's home for 6 more months, while Alexander renovated a nearby brownstone, creating a space that reflected their shared values rather than just his wealth. The transition hadn't been without challenges. Alexander had struggled to adapt to the rhythms of family life after decades of solitary focus on empire building. Sarah had fiercely maintained her independence, sometimes rejecting his well-intentioned efforts to smooth every path. They had argued, compromised, disappointed each other, and grown together through it all. "Do you think Mom will like her surprise?" Ethan asked as they neared home, referring to the small velvet box in Alexander's pocket. Not a ring, as might be expected, but something more significant to their unique journey. "I hope so," Alexander replied. "It represents a big change." When they entered the apartment, they found Sarah in the kitchen, medical textbooks spread across the counter as she prepared dinner and studied simultaneously, a skill she had perfected during her accelerated nursing program. "The chess master returns triumphant," Alexander announced, dropping a kiss on her cheek. 5 victories today." Sarah smiled at her son. "Against adults or other kids?" "Adults," Ethan said, trying and failing to sound nonchalant. "Including Dr. Feynman from Columbia." "Well done," Sarah high-fived him. "Now go wash up while I finish dinner." When Ethan had disappeared down the hallway, Alexander wrapped his arms around Sarah from behind, inhaling the familiar scent of her hair. "Happy anniversary," he murmured. She turned in his embrace. "Our first meeting was hardly an anniversary worth celebrating. You found my son selling his toys on a street corner." "I found my future," Alexander corrected her, "even if I didn't recognize it at the time." Sarah studied his face, her gaze as direct and penetrating as it had been that first night in the hospital. "No regrets?" The great Alexander Blackwood, terror of Wall Street, trading board meetings for parent-teacher conferences, and acquisition reports for 4th grade science projects. "Not a single one," he replied truthfully. "Though the board still hasn't forgiven me for wearing a tie with cartoon DNA strands to the shareholders' meeting. Apparently, Ethan's influence on my wardrobe is concerning to traditional investors." Sarah laughed, then grew serious. "Sometimes I still wake up wondering if this is all temporary. If one day you'll realize that the quiet life isn't enough after all." Rather than offering immediate reassurance, Alexander reached into his pocket and withdrew the velvet box. "I've been thinking about permanent changes, actually." Sarah eyed the box warily. "Alexander, it's not what you think," he said, opening it to reveal not a ring, but a key. "It's to the brownstone next door to the clinic in Queens, the one we've been renovating for the community health center. The foundation board approved the final funding yesterday. It's yours to direct however you see fit." Sarah's eyes widened as she took the key. "You're giving me control of the flagship project. What about the board's concerns about my limited executive experience?" I reminded them that limited executive experience was exactly what we needed. Someone who understands healthcare from the ground up, not from a spreadsheet. Alexander smiled. "Besides, you've been doing the work already. This just makes it official." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she clutched the key. "This means more than any ring could," she whispered. "Trust in my abilities, belief in my vision." That's how I knew I loved you, Alexander admitted. Not because you needed me or because I could rescue you, but because you showed me a different kind of strength, the kind that sustains rather than conquers. From the hallway came the sound of Ethan returning. Before he entered the kitchen, Sarah reached up and kissed Alexander deeply. "For the record," she murmured against his lips, "I do want the ring too. Eventually. On my terms." "Always on your terms," he agreed with a smile. "That's part of what I love about you." Later that evening, after dinner and Ethan's bedtime, Alexander and Sarah sat on their terrace, the city lights creating a tapestry of human connection that stretched to the horizon. A gentle spring breeze carried the scent of Sarah's herb garden, rosemary and basil and possibility. "I never imagined this life," Alexander confessed, his fingers intertwined with hers. "The metrics I used to measure success didn't have categories for any of this. For belonging, for purpose beyond accumulation, for the quiet joy of an ordinary evening." Sarah squeezed his hand. "There's nothing ordinary about finding your way back to what matters. Many people never do." Alexander thought of the rainy evening a year ago, of a boy selling his treasured possession out of desperate love, of the twist of fate or divine intervention that had placed him on that precise street corner at that exact moment. The statistical improbability of their meeting, the countless decisions that could have sent them on different trajectories, the fragility and resilience of the connection they had built. It all seemed like a miracle of the highest order. "I used to believe that power came from what you could control," Alexander reflected. "Now I know it comes from what you're willing to risk, what you're brave enough to feel." Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, her warmth a reminder of all he had gained by letting go of what he thought he wanted. "Not a bad return on investment for the price of a vintage action figure," she teased gently. Alexander laughed, the sound carrying into the night air, free, unburdened, real. If his younger self could see him now, domesticated, vulnerable, happier than he'd ever been wearing custom suits in corner offices, would he understand the wealth that couldn't be quantified, the richness that came not from acquisition, but from connection? Perhaps not. Some lessons couldn't be taught, they had to be lived. Some treasures couldn't be purchased, they had to be recognized. Some journeys couldn't be planned, they had to be trusted. As the city lights twinkled below them, Alexander Blackwood, once defined by wealth, now defined by heart, held close the true fortune he had stumbled upon that rainy evening. Not the billions in his accounts, but the love in this small family that had become his own. The greatest acquisition of his life had cost him nothing but his willingness to see value beyond a balance sheet, and in that surrender, he had gained everything that mattered. I've reached the end of this story, but I want it to continue through you. If this narrative touched your heart or made you reflect on your own choices, become part of our storytelling community. Tap the subscribe button. This small gesture means so much to me. Share in the comments which moment of this journey resonated most with you, and if you've ever experienced a chance encounter that changed the course of your life. Your stories are the true treasure of this channel, and that's why we continue here, week after week, sharing these narratives that remind us of what really matters. Until the next story, which I promise will be as special as you who have stayed with me until the end.